begin with the first panel, and Mr. Jayson Beckman, you have the floor now for 10 minutes. Please go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. So I have a couple of slides that talk about the work that we did. I think they will be pulled up.
They are there, yeah. You can go ahead, yeah.
Okay, sorry, I don't see them. Basically, I'm going to talk about first three slides, look at what we did for the ERS report. And then the last slide talks a bit about what we've been doing since then. We did this study, we started it a year and a half ago. When we commissioned the study, there was not a lot of information to go on besides what was in the farm to fork and biodiversity strategies. So looking through there, there's obviously many things that the EU would like to address regarding agriculture. These here in the top are those that we felt we had enough data and that we could accurately model. So these are the input reductions we consider in our analysis. Obviously, there are some other things that we excluded, one being organic production that was modeled by all the other reports after ours. We excluded it because although we knew that there was an overall target for the EU, we didn't know if this was going to be EU-wide or by country, and what commodities would be affected, as well as the reference year. As well as we didn't consider the environmental impacts, which, given that our study and all other studies find negative market impacts, the environmental impacts would be important to consider regarding trade-offs. In addition, the ERS report did not look at changes in productivity, but this is what I will talk about in the last slide. Finally, we had three scenarios. The first is if the EU is the only region that adopts them. The second scenario we consider is a middle scenario, where we say, what if some countries that are dependent on the EU as a destination for their agricultural exports also adopt these input reductions? So sort of what has been talked about in this mirror clause. And finally, we have a scenario that looks at what happens if all countries in the world adopted these input reductions. Next slide, please. Great. So although basically all the studies that have looked at this conclude that there's negative market impacts, there's different ways of getting at these results. And the differences in models is basically what people are interested in looking at. So for our work, we use what's called a general equilibrium model that takes into account all sectors and all regions of an economy. So we were primarily interested in the global impact from farm to fork and biodiversity strategies, as well as we wanted to get a measure of the impact to GDP. In addition, reducing pesticide usage could increase the amount of labor that is used by farms. So if you have more farmers pulling weeds, for example, and getting this labor would require coming from somewhere in the rest of the economy, so we wanted to account for that. Obviously, other studies have predominantly used a partial equilibrium approach. And I'm happy to talk more about the differences, but the primary difference is they're not able to consider all the sectors and perhaps not all the regions in the world, but they're able to focus more on the agricultural sector. So there's a lot more data requirements in terms of these partial equilibrium approaches. Finally, I don't think it's talked about too much in these other studies, but in our work, we use a database that is from 2014. And from our reading, it seemed that the farm to fork and biodiversity strategies would start somewhere around 2020. So we update our model, and basically our results are looking at what would happen from 2020 to 2030. We are also interested in looking at the impacts to global food security. So along with our general equilibrium model, we also use this International Food Security Assessment model that we have at ERS that looks at how changes in food prices affect the 77 low and middle income countries. Next slide. So this is basic results for that first scenario, the EU only adopting, which is the most comparable to the JRC or the other studies. Basically, you can see that if you're going to reduce inputs into any sort of production, you're obviously going to get a decrease in the production. And prices increase. Model estimates for total agriculture in the EU an increase in prices of 17%, a decrease in exports, a decrease in farm income. We calculate food cost. This is per person per year, and it's $153, and a decrease in GDP of $71 billion. For the US and all other countries in the world, they have a very small change in production. In the US, it was an increase of about 0.4% as they try to fill some of that lost EU production. Prices increase as the US and other countries are exporting more to the EU. Farm income in the US is estimated to increase. Food costs are about a third of what they are in the EU, and there's a small change in US GDP. For the world, the decrease we estimate is basically a function of that EU loss. Prices increase by 9%, global trade decreases, and we have an estimate of food insecurity of 22 million people. And the decrease in global GDP, we estimate, is basically 70% of it is coming from the EU. Next slide. Okay, so after we released our report, there was some criticism, one of them being that we are ignoring any sort of productivity change. So what we've done since then is we've published a journal article in one of the top agricultural economics journals, and it basically says how much productivity would be necessary to mitigate those price impacts. So you can see the agricultural commodity on the left-hand side. The second column shows how much productivity growth would be needed. And then the third column, what we do is we take how much productivity growth would be needed and calculate based on EU historical agricultural productivity how many years would be necessary to meet those targets. So you can see that fruits, nuts, and vegetables and livestock have the smallest amount of productivity necessary, so about 9 years of productivity gains would be necessary to mitigate those price impacts, and it goes all the way up to 27 years for coarse grains, oilseeds, and raw sugar. Of course, one important point about technology is in order to get these gains, you need investment in R&D, which is going to cost money. In addition, there's a lot of years required to bring necessary productivity growth, of testing the new seeds or whatever, of getting farmers to implement these productivity gains. So even though we are showing a range of 9 to 27 years, this is not really considering the necessary time to get those products to market. That's it.